Who knew what and when did they know it? Those questions are at the heart of the intelligence controversy rocking Parliament Hill. Conservative MP Michael Chong and his family were allegedly targeted by Beijing in 2021. That's after he sponsored a motion condemning China's treatment of the Uyghur minority. CSIS flagged that information at the time in a top-secret memo, and the Prime Minister insisted Wednesday that this memo was never shared outside of the intelligence agency. But that statement was quickly contradicted.
I've just been informed by the National Security Advisor that the CSIS intelligence assessment of July 20th, 2021 was sent by CSIS to the relevant departments and to the National Security Advisor in the PCO.
When asked to clarify, the Prime Minister said this earlier today.
In terms of what I shared the best information I had at the time on Wednesday, both to Mr. Chong and to Canadians.
Ian Brodie served as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper from 2006 to 2008. He is now a professor at the University of Calgary's Department of Political Science and a director at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Mr. Brodie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
Let's start with what the Prime Minister said or didn't say today, because he had an opportunity to clear up the confusion about the contradictory statements about who knew what when, but he really declined to do so. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it is unfortunate that on Wednesday the Prime Minister went out and said this report about Mr. Chong's family didn't leave the Security Intelligence Service. I'm not sure that anybody in the business really thought that was a very solid answer at the time, because it's natural for CSIS to share its reporting of this sort broadly across other security services and the Cabinet Office, the Privy Council office in Ottawa. Apparently, it seems that the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor called Mr. Chong yesterday to correct that and say that, in fact, it had been shared with her predecessor at the time.
So we know then that it did make it in there, despite what the Prime Minister said the other day. He says he had bad information, but it was the best information that he had at the time. Is it conceivable, Mr. Brodie, that it could be shared with the PCO and shared with other departments, but not get to the prime ministerial level, in your experience?
Well, I think what we don't have yet, the Prime Minister's staff, the Prime Minister's political staff. In my experience, anything that deals with an MP or anyone at the political level will be automatically shared with the Prime Minister's office and brought to the Prime Minister's attention as quickly as possible. So unless there's been some breakdown of the process here, I expect we'll find in due course this was shared with people very close to the Prime Minister, and I expect shared with the Prime Minister at the time.
What if it wasn't? I mean, what if this was not? What if they're telling the truth today? Because Marco Mendicino said today, you know, it's a big failure that CSIS didn't directly brief the Public Safety Minister. They didn't brief the Prime Minister. If it didn't get to them, how big of a failure is that?
Well, I think that's, again, it's a little hard for me to understand how that might have happened because, you know, since the September 11th terrorist attacks, all of this information is shared broadly inside government, you know, not just within the Public Safety Department. I guess the question is then, why was the government, sending the message to its security agencies that it did not take the challenge of Chinese political interference in the Canadian political process seriously? We've had reports about this coming on for 10 years now. This is not a new issue. Is it possible that over time, I think we've heard media reports that CSIS warned the Prime Minister's office that one of the Liberal candidates was in a challenging position here, and it seems they did nothing about that. What has happened inside this government that has persuaded security agencies that they just don't want to hear about this problem of Chinese interference through the Liberal Party, through other parties in Parliament, through Mr. Trudeau's possibly family foundation here? What is it that has persuaded people to put down their pens here and to start leaking things to news organizations?
In this particular incident, this intelligence assessment was sent, as I understand it, around the 20th of July, 2021 to the Privy Council office. That's a couple of weeks before the 2021 election started. It was at a time when the Prime Minister had a bit of a rotation of national security advisors in his office. It was a period actually where they had an acting person who was just there for a couple of weeks. Does it suggest to you that getting ready for the election and a transition in that advisory role may have created a big crack that this just fell through?
No, I don't find that very persuasive at all, David. The National Security Advisor's office in the Privy Council office has dozens of people working for it. It's true there was a changeover of National Security Advisor, the person in charge, but all the principal deputies were there through the transition. They were all on the job throughout this period. They're all security professionals, and they would have understood a report coming across their desk suggesting that the family of a Canadian member of Parliament was being threatened overseas because of debates going on in the House of Commons is an issue that requires political attention right away and some kind of response, if not just to make sure that the MP's family is safe in Hong Kong. So, these are not issues where there's one person, has a bad day or is off at a doctor's appointment and the system falls apart. For the last 20 years, we've built a national security system to be robust against changes, to take out that kind of personal discretion, to make sure that everybody's working together towards protecting the national security interest.
So it's not credible, in your view, that something this urgent wouldn't have made its way at least to the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister or a senior advisor to the Prime Minister to have it brought to the attention of the Prime Minister?
Anything that dealt with political threats of this nature came up to my desk very quickly. That was in my experience a long time ago. And from what I understand, the system has only become more formal and more dependable since then. So I don't think we've heard the end of this. I expect it will be over the weekend and during the course of the Liberal Convention. The Public Service will be doing their investigation of who knew what when, but I don't expect we've heard the end of this. No, I don't.
The other big issue they're grappling with right now at the center of government is what to do about this Chinese diplomat at the center of this alleged interference plot. Nobody's been kicked out of the country despite all of these things. I mean, does this surprise you that the government has yet to take definitive action against any Chinese diplomat connected with any of the developments we've seen in the past few months?
I'm astounded at this. Diplomats who are serving in Canada have usually some form of diplomatic immunity. That's why they can't ordinarily be arrested for these sorts of activities in Canada. The recourse is that the federal government has unrestricted discretion to eject a foreign diplomat accredited to Canada at any time. I'm not sure why this didn't happen 2 years ago. It could situation worse given what was going on between Canada and China. That's possible. But now that this report has been out since Monday, I do wonder what they've been waiting for. This has to take place as quickly as possible. And if there are some interests in Canada that have to be secured, I assume the government is securing those interests right now in an effort to get on with things. But there's a bigger issue here. This is not just an issue of the personal treatment of Mr. Chong's family and one individual Chinese official accredited in Toronto. If Mr. Chong is at risk here, there are other MPs with family in China who may also be at risk, and there's a broad Chinese diplomatic representation here. The government has to get on with this particular instance because there is a much broader set of issues here they need to get attention to, and have so far, as far as we can tell, done very little about.
You made the point that they could be consolidating interest in China in preparation of some sort of action, I guess getting key players out of there. But it looks like delay on the outside, no matter what activity is happening internally. What kind of message do you think this delay and the lack of action at this point sends to the regime in Beijing?
Look, the foreign minister went to committee yesterday, told Mr. Chong, we can't take action against this diplomat because we're worried about the things the Chinese might do to us. That itself is a dangerous message to send overseas in a situation like this. And the longer this goes on, the worse that gets.
Ian Brodie, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you joining us today.
Good to talk to you, David.
Okay, so that's the view of a former top political staffer. For more on this story, we turn to a former top civil servant. Senator Ian Shugart served as clerk of the Privy Council from April 2019 to March 2021. Senator, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, David.
So I want to make clear with that timeline, you had left the Privy Council office 4 months before this intelligence assessment landed in the office. Ian Brodie says it's not conceivable that something like this would have come into the Privy Council office and not made its way at least to the Chief of Staff and then been briefed up to the Prime Minister. What is your sense on how something like this would have been handled in PCO when you were there?
Well, every case is a little bit different. I would say that this kind of assessment, particularly involving a member of Parliament, would have raised flags and would have gone to the attention of the National Security Advisor and been raised politically. And I would suggest that it would be appropriate that the member of Parliament would be informed as well. Now, that's a general statement, and I think it's important that we understand that every case is different. and there may be specifics about a case that justify it being dealt with in a different way, whether the level of seriousness or other circumstances. But as a general idea, particularly where a member of parliament or a parliamentarian is involved, I would have thought that there would be a more rapid transfer of information.
If intelligence like this never made it to the political level, which is certainly what the Prime Minister, the Public Safety Minister at the time, Bill Blair, and the current Public Safety Minister, Marco Mendicino, have all said, if it in fact did not make it to the political level, how big of a failure is that, do you think, in the internal machine of government?
Well, I don't want to comment on the statements that have been made this week. I must confess, I have not followed them closely, so I don't want to say anything in error. I think the fact that Mr. Chong has been briefed this week, and there have been indications that this should have been done at the time, is pretty much an acknowledgement that something didn't go as it should have. What exactly that was and the reasons for it, I don't want to hazard an opinion, but I think the fact that it's been dealt with this week with Mr. Chong is an indicator that everyone feels that it should have been done earlier.
Okay, the other issue that's come out of this is that the government is assessing whether or not to expel a Chinese diplomat who has been connected with this. They've already summoned in the Chinese ambassador. What goes into that decision? I mean, what does that process look like internally when weighing whether or not to declare a diplomat from a foreign country persona non grata?
Let me say, first of all, that there are typically unwritten rules, although some of them may be written, about what is acceptable behavior by staff of any country's mission in the host country. And that's what we call it, the host country. Mm-hmm. When those rules are broken, the mission is responsible for the conduct of their personnel. And there's a language in diplomacy. And sometimes it is calling the ambassador in for conversations. Sounds like nothing, but it has meaning. All the way through to expelling personnel from an embassy, all the way through to recalling an ambassador and so on. That's a language of diplomacy that has real meaning. And when there are infractions by an embassy or a mission, it can be the embassy, it can be the consulate, it's up to the host country to determine how serious that is. Now, it's easy to say, but hard to do, that we should just expel a diplomat. But in a case like Canada and China, we have to bear in mind the scale of these two countries. What are the number of people that we have in our mission in Beijing, as opposed to the number of people that China has in their mission here in Ottawa? We take the case of the two Michaels held in detention in China. There were, let's remember, voices in Canada, some very prominent voices, well-respected voices, who are arguing that we should have done a deal with the Chinese government early in the process, resolve this, put it to bed. Right. The government didn't do that because of a risk assessment based on the long-term implications. And it was the right decision, which many people supported the government for, including Parliament as a whole supported the government in its stance. So what are the factors you take into account? They are clearly economic blowback. They are diplomatic opportunity, including expulsion of our own diplomats, reducing our capacity to do our function in that foreign country, including knowing what's going on in that country. There are a lot of things to consider. Now, I'm not privy to the considerations that the government is currently undertaking with respect to this individual in I think the consulate, but those are the kinds of things that will go into that decision, and they're made with a combination of the policy objectives and what is the right thing to do in terms of, for example, the stand that this government has taken against hostage diplomacy, as well as the real life implications for this country and its citizens of taking certain actions.
Having balanced all of that, do you think it's at the point where Canada needs to do something? Because I think the stories and the revelations about the level of Chinese involvement in intellectual property theft and foreign influence and pressure on politicians now, they're quite expansive, quite profound. And there was another CSIS assessment that came out that says China kind of sees Canada as a low-risk target because of the lack of consequence. Given all of that, do you think it's time for the government of Canada to take a stand on these things?
Well, I would say I'd make a distinction between taking a stand on these issues and what the government should do in a particular decision about expulsion.
Yeah.
I'm not going to comment publicly and in effect advise the government on what it should do. I'm not in that role anymore, and I'm not privy to the details. And you and viewers should take with a grain of salt what I say as a former clerk and deputy minister of foreign affairs. My opinion is only as good as the information I have access to. But clearly, countries like Canada have to take a stand, which is why we have said that we're not going to give in to, for example, hostage diplomacy. And I think Canada proved that point in the case of the two Michaels. But look, this is going to get, if anything, more difficult. And we're going to have to learn from these lessons. And we're going to have to be very hard-headed and very realistic. And we're going to have to adopt every tool in the toolkit to equip ourselves to deal with this world which has been evolving for the last half decade and longer.
Senator Ian Shugart, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.